My grandmother saved 2 freezing Bigfoot babies during the worst blizzard in Montana history, and the next morning, 9 full-grown members of their tribe appeared at her doorstep. What happened in those hours would remain her most closely guarded secret for 67 years, until 3 days before she died, when she finally told me the truth that changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in our forests. My name is Marcus Henderson. I'm 71 years old, a retired wildlife biologist who spent 43 years studying North American megafauna for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have 3 doctoral degrees, peer-reviewed publications in every major scientific journal, and a reputation built on empirical evidence and methodical research. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to share sounds impossible, and I need you to understand that I didn't believe it either. Not at first. Not until I spent 5 years after my grandmother's death in 2019 investigating every detail of her story, cross-referencing historical records, weather data, and archived documents that proved, at least in part, that what she told me actually happened. My grandmother, Eleanor Henderson, was 67 years old in February of 1952. She lived alone in a cabin 43 miles northwest of Kalispell, Montana, deep in what was then truly wilderness territory. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. The nearest town, a logging community called Whitefish, required a 2-hour drive on unpaved roads that became impassable for months during winter. She'd moved there with my grandfather in 1938, homesteading on 160 acres of dense forest at the base of the Whitefish Range. When my grandfather died of a heart attack in 1949, everyone expected Eleanor to move to town, to live with family, to do what any sensible widow in her 60s would do. Instead, she stayed. She knew those woods better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. She'd worked as a midwife for scattered homesteading families throughout the region, traveling on snowshoes in winter, on horseback in summer, delivering babies and treating injuries with a combination of formal nursing training and practical frontier medicine. She was tough in a way that's hard to explain to people who didn't live through the Depression and settled in a wild country. Self-reliant, resourceful, completely comfortable with isolation and hardship. The winter of 1952 was brutal across the northern Rockies. I've verified this through National Weather Service archives and old newspaper records. January brought temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks. By early February, the snowpack was already at record levels. Then, on February 11th, the Weather Bureau issued warnings for what they called a historic storm system moving south from Canada. The predictions were severe blizzard conditions, wind chills approaching 60 below, whiteout visibility. Eleanor had weathered dozens of Montana winters. She knew how to prepare. She spent February 11th hauling extra firewood into the covered porch, filling every container with water from the hand pump before the mechanism froze, checking her food stores, and securing shutters. Her journal from that day, which I now have, contains a simple entry. A big storm is coming. Ready as I'll be. Chicken secured, wood stacked, lamp oil topped off. But the day before the storm hit, something unusual happened. Eleanor documented this too, though at the time she didn't understand its significance. She'd gone out mid-morning to check her trap line, a route she ran to catch rabbits and occasionally marten for fur and food. About half a mile from her cabin, near a frozen creek bed she knew well, she found tracks. Her journal describes them precisely. Barefoot prints, humanoid shape, approximately 14 inches long, pressed deep into snow from 2 days prior. Stride length roughly 4.5 feet, too large for a human, wrong shape for a bear. She'd seen bear tracks her entire adult life. These were different. No claw marks, distinct toe impressions, a walking pattern that suggested bipedal movement. She made rough sketches in her journal. The drawings show exactly what she saw. 5 toes, broad flat foot, an arch that looked disturbingly human. She followed the tracks for maybe 200 yards before losing them where the creature, whatever it was, had walked across a windswept ridge where snow hadn't accumulated. She returned home unsettled but not frightened. Eleanor had spent decades in the wilderness. She'd encountered grizzlies, wolves, and mountain lions. She respected the forest's dangers but didn't fear them irrationally. Still, something about those tracks bothered her. That night, February 11th, she wrote another journal entry. Heard calls in the distance after sunset. Not wolves, not elk, something else. Too dark to investigate. A storm is coming anyway. The blizzard hit just after midnight on February 12th. Eleanor woke to the sound of wind that she later described as sounding like freight trains colliding. By dawn, the temperature had dropped to 41 degrees below zero. Snow fell so thick she couldn't see her woodshed 20 feet from the cabin. The wind sculpted drifts that buried her windows on the north side. She kept the fire burning, rationed her lamp oil, and waited. This was survival in 1952 Montana. You didn't go out in storms like this. You stayed inside and prayed your shelter held. But sometime around midnight on February 13th, almost 24 hours into the blizzard, Eleanor heard something that changed everything. Through the screaming wind, through walls chinked with moss and newspaper, she heard a sound that didn't belong. A cry, high-pitched and distressed, that cut through the storm's chaos. Not human, but not entirely animal either. It came from somewhere very close to her cabin. Eleanor sat upright in her bed, every sense suddenly alert despite the late hour. The sound came again, clearer this time, cutting through a momentary lull in the wind. A vocalization that held unmistakable distress, the kind of cry that anyone who'd spent years caring for living things would recognize immediately as a call for help. She threw off her quilts and moved to the window, scraping frost from the inside of the glass with her fingernail. Through the narrow, clear spot, she could see nothing but driving snow illuminated by the faint glow of her banked fire, reflecting off the white chaos outside. The wind picked up again, shaking the cabin's frame, rattling the stovepipe. Any sensible person would have climbed back into bed, told themselves it was just the storm creating phantom sounds, tricks of wind through trees. But Eleanor had delivered 47 babies in backcountry cabins and tents. She'd set broken bones, treated pneumonia, sat vigil through difficult nights when patients teetered between life and death. She knew the sound of a creature in mortal distress, and whatever was out there was dying. She pulled on her wool long underwear, 2 pairs of socks, her heaviest pants, 3 shirts layered under a thick coat her grandfather had worn. She wrapped a scarf around her face, pulled a wool cap low over her ears, forced her feet into boots she'd waterproofed with bear grease. She took a kerosene lantern, though she knew it would be nearly useless in the wind, and a coil of rope that she tied around her waist with the other end secured to a beam near her door. In whiteout conditions, people walked 20 feet from their homes and became disoriented, wandered until they collapsed. The rope was her lifeline. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she opened the door. The wind tried to rip it from her hinges. Snow drove into her face with the force of thrown sand, ice crystals that stung exposed skin. She couldn't see more than 3 or 4 feet ahead. The lantern's flame guttered and nearly died. She pulled the door shut behind her, and immediately the cabin disappeared into white chaos. She was alone in a void of wind and snow, and cold that burned her lungs with each breath, even through the scarf. She heard the sound again, closer now, coming from the direction of her woodshed. She moved forward slowly, testing each step before committing her weight, following the rope that played out behind her. The wind tried to knock her down. Snow had drifted against the woodshed's wall, creating a slope that rose nearly to the roof's edge. When she rounded the corner into the structure's slight wind shelter, her lantern revealed something that made her freeze completely. Two small shapes huddled against the woodshed's base, partially buried in snow that had drifted and crusted over them. At first, her mind insisted they were dogs, maybe wolf pups, lost from a den. But as she moved closer, holding the lantern higher, the light revealed the truth. They were approximately 3 feet tall, bodies covered in fur that looked reddish-brown where it wasn't crusted with ice and snow. Their faces were visible, turned toward each other as they huddled for warmth. And those faces were both human and not human. Broad noses, heavy brow ridges, but eyes that were too large, too expressive to be simply animal. Their hands, clutched together, showed 5 fingers with what looked like fingernails, not claws. They were juveniles, clearly young, and they were covered in ice. Their fur had frozen into hard shells. They weren't moving except for shallow, irregular breathing that Eleanor could see in small clouds of vapor. She knelt beside them, her mind racing. Every bit of medical training, every frontier instinct told her these creatures were in the final stages of hypothermia. Their bodies had stopped shivering, which meant their core temperatures had dropped to critical levels. They would die within the hour, maybe less, if she left them here. Her hands moved automatically, checking for injuries, feeling for pulses at their necks. Their skin beneath the fur was cold, far too cold, but she felt heartbeats, slow and weak. One of them, the slightly smaller one, made a soft sound when she touched it, barely audible over the wind. Its eyes flickered open for just a moment, unfocused, and she saw intelligence there, awareness, fear. Getting them inside required strength. Eleanor didn't think she still possessed at 67. Each creature weighed at least 60 pounds, dead weight, their bodies limp and unresponsive. She couldn't carry both at once. She lifted the smaller one first, cradling it against her chest, feeling the terrible coldness of its body even through all her layers. She followed the rope back to her cabin, fighting wind that seemed determined to push her down, opened the door with numb fingers, and laid the first creature on the rug near her wood stove. Then she went back out into the blizzard. The second trip was harder. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned from the cold air, and halfway back to the cabin, she slipped on ice beneath the snow, nearly dropping the creature. But she made it, pulled both of them inside, and slammed the door against the storm. In the warm glow of her cabin's firelight, Eleanor could see them clearly for the first time. They were covered in matted, frozen fur, ice crystals clinging to every hair. Their eyes were closed now, both of them completely unresponsive. She'd treated hypothermia before in humans. The protocol was the same regardless of species. Warm them gradually, remove wet clothing, or in this case, somehow deal with the frozen fur, provide warm liquids if they could swallow, monitor their breathing and pulse. She built up the fire until it roared, moved them as close as she dared without risking burns. She brought towels and began carefully, methodically, working the ice out of their fur, starting with their extremities and working toward their cores. The ice came off in sheets. Underneath, their fur was thick and surprisingly soft. She wrapped them in every blanket she owned, covering them completely except for their faces. Their breathing remained shallow, but seemed to stabilize slightly in the warmth. Eleanor spent the next hour working with the focused intensity she had learned through decades of frontier nursing. She heated water on her stove and mixed it with sugar and a pinch of salt, creating a solution she'd used countless times to treat dehydration and shock. The challenge was getting the creatures to swallow. They were still barely conscious, their bodies fighting to maintain the most basic functions. She cradled the smaller one's head, supporting it the way she would an infant, and carefully dribbled tiny amounts of the warm liquid into its mouth. At first, nothing happened. Then she saw its throat move slightly, an automatic swallow reflex. She continued, patient and methodical, giving it time between each small sip. The larger one responded similarly when she repeated the process, showing the same involuntary swallowing. It wasn't much, but it was something. It meant their bodies were still fighting to survive. As the cabin warmed and the creatures began to thaw, Eleanor pulled her rocking chair close to where they lay and simply watched them. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, wind hammering against the walls, snow building drifts that she knew would take days to dig through. But inside her small cabin, lit by firelight and a single kerosene lamp, she studied the two beings she'd rescued from the storm. They were clearly juveniles, she estimated equivalent to 3- or 4-year-old human children based on their size and proportions. Their faces, now that she could see them clearly, were remarkable. Not quite human, not quite ape, but something in between. Their foreheads sloped more than a human child's would, and their brow ridges were pronounced, but their eyes were positioned forward like humans, built for depth perception and intelligence. Their noses were broad and flat, their mouths wide with lips that were fuller than a gorilla's, but less defined than a person's. Their hands, which she examined carefully without touching them, showed opposable thumbs and fingernails that were thick but definitely nails, not claws. What struck Eleanor most forcefully was their behavior toward each other. Even in their semi-conscious state, they remained pressed together, the larger one's arm draped protectively over the smaller one. Several times during that long night, one would make a soft sound, and the other would respond. Gentle vocalizations that sounded almost like cooing. They were caring for each other, communicating comfort despite their condition. Eleanor had seen this kind of bonding in human siblings, in young animals she'd helped treat over the years. These creatures, whatever they were, had emotional bonds, family connections. They weren't just animals operating on instinct. There was something deeper happening here, something that reminded her powerfully of the human children she'd helped bring into the world. She kept the fire burning hot, adding wood every 30 minutes, maintaining the cabin's temperature. Around 3 in the morning, she noticed the larger creature's breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more regular. Its chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm that suggested it had passed the most critical danger point. The smaller one took longer, its breathing remaining shallow and irregular until almost 4:30. Eleanor stayed awake through it all, monitoring them constantly, adjusting their blankets, giving them more of the sugar water whenever they seemed capable of swallowing. Her back ached from sitting in the rocking chair. Her eyes burned from exhaustion and smoke, but she didn't allow herself to sleep. She'd lost patience before by falling asleep during critical hours. She wouldn't make that mistake with these two. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The storm's intensity had lessened slightly, though snow still fell and wind still howled. Eleanor stood stiffly, her joints protesting, and moved to the window. She scraped away frost and looked out at a transformed landscape. Snow had buried everything, creating drifts that reached halfway up her cabin walls in places. Her woodshed was barely visible. The forest beyond had disappeared behind curtains of falling snow. It was the kind of storm that would be talked about for years, the kind that killed livestock and sometimes people who weren't prepared. When she turned back to check on the creatures, she found 4 eyes watching her. Both of them were awake, fully conscious now, and the change was immediate and dramatic. The moment they realized she was looking at them, they scrambled backward as far as the blankets would allow, pressing themselves against the wall near the stove. The larger one positioned itself in front of the smaller one, making a sound Eleanor had never heard before, a low warbling that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's walls. It wasn't aggressive exactly, but it was clearly a warning. They were terrified. Eleanor moved slowly, deliberately, making herself small and non-threatening. She sat down on the floor, farther from them than from the door, showing them she wasn't blocking their escape route. She kept her hands visible, palms up, and spoke in the soft, calm voice she'd used with frightened children during difficult births. "It's all right," she said quietly. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." The creatures watched her with eyes that showed far too much understanding. They clutched each other, the smaller one peering around the larger one's shoulder. Their fur, now dry and fluffy from the fire's heat, stood out around their bodies, making them look almost like auburn-colored clouds. They were beautiful in a strange, impossible way. Eleanor noticed their eyes kept darting to the door, then back to her, then to the door again. They wanted to leave, that was clear, but the storm outside made that impossible. She could see them processing this, weighing their fear of her against the memory of the killing cold beyond those walls. Very slowly, she stood and moved to her table, keeping her movements smooth and predictable. She took an apple from her root cellar basket and a piece of dried venison from her pantry. She set both items on the floor, midway between herself and the creatures, then backed away to her rocking chair. "Food," she said simply. "You must be hungry." The larger one tilted its head slightly, watching her face, and Eleanor could have sworn she saw calculation in those eyes, an attempt to understand her intentions. They didn't move toward the food, but they didn't take their eyes off it either. Outside, the storm continued, and inside, an old woman and 2 Bigfoot children waited for whatever would come next. The storm finally broke just before dawn on February 14th. Eleanor woke in her rocking chair, stiff and cold despite the fire she'd kept burning through the night. The wind had stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt unnatural after 2 days of constant howling. She stood slowly, every joint protesting, and moved to the window. The world outside had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, everything buried under snow that sparkled in the early morning light. Drifts reached 6 and 7 feet in places, sculpted into smooth curves and sharp edges by the wind. The sky was crystal clear, that particular shade of blue that only comes after major winter storms. And at the edge of her clearing, just where the forest began, stood figures that made her blood freeze in her veins. There were at least 8 of them, possibly 9. It was hard to tell because they stood so still they could have been trees, except trees didn't stand like that. They were massive, easily 7 to 9 feet tall, their bodies covered in fur that ranged from dark brown to reddish to almost black. They stood in a loose group, completely motionless, and every single one of them was staring directly at her cabin. Eleanor's hand went to her throat. Behind her, she heard the 2 young ones making sounds, soft, chirping vocalizations that grew more urgent. They'd sensed the presence of their family, their tribe, whatever these creatures called their social groups. The larger juvenile moved to the window, standing on its back legs to peer out, and when it saw the figures at the tree line, it made a sound that was unmistakably joyful. A rising call that sounded almost like laughter mixed with crying. Eleanor understood immediately what was happening. These creatures had come for their young. They'd been searching through the blizzard, tracking, looking, and now that the storm had cleared, they'd found where the babies had taken shelter, or been taken. She looked at the assembled group outside and felt the weight of the situation settle over her like a heavy blanket. These were parents, family members, and they were watching a human who had their children. She had no illusions about what they could do to her if they chose. Any one of those massive figures could tear her cabin apart with their bare hands. But they weren't attacking. They were waiting, watching. And in that patience, Eleanor recognized something she'd seen before in desperate mothers, a willingness to do anything necessary, but a hope that violence wouldn't be required. The young ones were becoming increasingly agitated, pressing against the door, making urgent sounds toward the forest. Eleanor knew what she had to do. She moved to her bed and pulled the 2 blankets the creatures had been wrapped in, thick wool quilts her grandmother had made half a century ago. She wrapped each juvenile carefully, tucking the blankets around their small bodies. They didn't resist, perhaps understanding this was protection against the cold that had nearly killed them. She pulled on her own coat, wrapped her scarf around her face, and opened the door. The cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and snow. The temperature had risen to maybe 15 degrees, almost balmy compared to the night before. She stepped out onto her porch, the 2 young ones following close behind her, staying near her legs like frightened children. The figures at the tree line shifted slightly, a ripple of movement through the group. Eleanor could see them more clearly now in the growing light. They were magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Broad shoulders that seemed impossibly wide, arms that hung past their knees, faces that combined human and ape features in ways that shouldn't exist, but did. And their eyes, even from 50 yards away, she could see their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She gently guided the 2 juveniles forward, helping them down the porch steps, supporting them as they struggled through snow that came up to their chests. She walked them about halfway across her clearing, maybe 25 feet from her cabin, and then stopped. This was as far as her courage would take her. She knelt in the snow beside the young ones and carefully unwrapped them from the blankets. They needed to go to their family, but she wanted them to have protection for those final yards. One figure separated from the group, a large female Eleanor guessed, moving forward with careful, deliberate steps. She was perhaps 8 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur that was matted and crusted with ice in places. Her face was broad and expressive, and as she got closer, Eleanor could see the raw emotion there, fear mixed with desperate hope, mixed with something that looked heartbreakingly like grief. This was the mother, Eleanor was certain. She could see it in every line of the creature's body, in the way her massive hands trembled slightly as she approached, in the sounds she was making, soft, urgent vocalizations directed at the 2 young ones. The juveniles pulled away from Eleanor and stumbled forward through the snow, crying out in response. The mother closed the distance in 3 long strides, dropped to her knees, and swept both young ones into her arms. What happened next would stay with Eleanor for the rest of her life. The mother held her children, pulling them against her chest, rocking them the way any mother would, human or otherwise. Her hands moved over their bodies, checking for injuries, feeling for broken bones, examining them with a thoroughness that spoke of intelligence and medical knowledge. The other creatures had moved closer now, forming a semicircle around the reunion, and Eleanor could see the family structure clearly. Several other females, 2 massive males, what looked like adolescents, and older juveniles. They were all focused on the babies, all making soft sounds of what could only be relief. One of the males approached the mother and gently touched the smaller juvenile's head, his enormous hand completely covering the small skull. A father, Eleanor thought, or perhaps an uncle or older sibling. Family, definitely family. Eleanor started to back away, giving them space, returning to her porch. But before she could take more than a few steps, the largest male separated from the group. He was enormous, probably 9 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been 4.5 feet across. His fur was dark brown, almost black, grizzled with gray around his face and chest. He moved toward Eleanor with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive, each step placed carefully in the deep snow. Eleanor's heart hammered, but she held her ground, sensing that running would be the worst thing she could do. The male stopped about 10 feet from her, close enough that she could see the individual hairs of his fur moving in the slight breeze, close enough to see the intelligence burning in his dark eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor felt evaluated, judged, understood in ways that went beyond language. Then he reached behind him and pulled something from where it had been tucked against his back. An elk hide, massive and perfectly preserved, the fur thick and lustrous. He held it for a moment, then bent forward and placed it carefully in the snow at Eleanor's feet. He straightened, placed one huge hand over his chest, directly over where his heart would be, and held it there. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She understood perfectly. This was gratitude, acknowledgement, respect. She placed her own hand over her heart and nodded. The male held her gaze for another moment, then turned and walked back to his family. They gathered the 2 young ones, surrounded them with protective bodies, and as a group they melted back into the forest, leaving only tracks in the snow to prove they'd ever been there at all. Eleanor stood on her porch for a long time after they disappeared, watching the tree line where the family had vanished. The silence felt different now, not empty, but full of presence, as though the forest itself had witnessed something sacred and was holding its breath. She looked down at the elk hide at her feet, the gift that proved this hadn't been some hypothermia-induced hallucination. The hide was enormous, easily 7 feet long and 5 feet wide, the fur thick and perfectly prepared. Someone had scraped it clean, worked it soft, treated it with skill that matched anything Eleanor had seen from experienced trappers. She bent and lifted it, surprised by its weight, and carried it inside her cabin. The 2 blankets she'd wrapped around the young ones lay crumpled in the snow where she'd left them. She retrieved those too, shaking off the powder, and brought them back inside. The cabin felt strange now, too quiet and too empty after the presence of the 2 juveniles. Eleanor hung the elk hide over her rocking chair and sat down heavily, her body finally registering the exhaustion of 2 days without real sleep. Her hands were shaking, whether from cold or delayed shock she couldn't say. She'd just made contact with creatures that weren't supposed to exist, creatures that science insisted were myths or hoaxes or misidentified bears. But she knew what she'd seen. She knew the weight of those small bodies when she'd carried them from the storm. She knew the intelligence in their eyes, the family bonds she'd witnessed, the gratitude expressed in that ceremonial gift. These weren't animals, not in the way that word was usually meant. They were people, different people, but people nonetheless with language and culture and emotional lives as complex as any humans. Over the following days, as she dug out from the storm and resumed her normal routines, Eleanor processed what had happened. She fed her chickens, carried water, split wood, all the usual tasks of frontier living. But her mind kept returning to those hours with the young ones, to the moment of exchange with the enormous male. She thought about telling someone, sharing this impossible story with her daughter who lived in Kalispell, or perhaps with Doc Morrison in Whitefish who'd worked with her on difficult cases over the years. But each time she considered it, she imagined the response. They'd think the isolation had finally gotten to her, that she'd had some kind of breakdown. Or worse, they'd believe her, and word would spread, and hunters and scientists and curiosity seekers would flood these mountains looking for proof. She'd seen what happened when rare animals were discovered. They were hunted, captured, studied, caged, killed for specimens. The thought of those two small ones, or their mother, or that dignified male ending up as trophies or laboratory subjects made her physically ill. So, Eleanor made a decision. She would keep this secret, protect it the way she'd protect any patient's confidential information. She'd spent her career as a midwife being trusted with private moments, with vulnerable times in people's lives, and she'd never betrayed those trusts. This felt the same, a sacred confidence that wasn't hers to share. She took out her journal, the same one where she'd documented the strange tracks in the storm, and she wrote down everything that had happened. Every detail she could remember, from the sound of the juveniles' distressed cries to the texture of their fur to the exact way the male had placed his hand over his heart. She drew sketches of their faces, their hands, their feet. She measured the elk hide precisely, documenting its dimensions and the quality of its preparation. But after she'd written it all down, she wrapped the journal in oilcloth and hid it in a metal box beneath the floorboards under her bed, along with important papers and a small amount of emergency money. Some truths were too dangerous to leave lying around. The elk hide she kept, though. She used it as a blanket on the coldest nights, draped it over her rocking chair, ran her hands through its thick fur when she sat by the fire in the evenings. It became her most treasured possession, more valuable than anything else she owned, because it represented something she'd never expected to experience. Proof of a world that existed alongside the human world, hidden and secret and determined to remain that way. She thought often about why the male had given it to her. It wasn't just thanks for saving the young ones, though surely that was part of it. It was also, she believed, a form of communication, a message that said, "We see you, we acknowledge you, we trust you to keep our secret." The hide was both a gift and responsibility, honor and burden. In the weeks and months that followed, Eleanor watched the forest differently. She paid attention to signs she'd previously dismissed or not recognized. Bent branches in patterns that didn't occur naturally. Arrangements of stones near the creek that changed positions. Sometimes tracks in mud or snow that appeared and disappeared. She never saw the family again, not directly, but she knew they were there. Once, about 6 weeks after the blizzard, she found a pile of freshly caught fish on a stump near her cabin, salmon that had been cleaned and arranged carefully. Another time, she discovered a broken section of her split rail fence had been repaired, the rails lifted back into position by something with tremendous strength. The family was watching over her now, reciprocating her care, protecting the human who'd protected their children. Eleanor lived alone in that cabin for another 15 years before age finally forced her to move to town in 1967. She was 82 by then, her joints too stiff for the physical demands of frontier life, her eyes too dim for the careful work required to survive in isolation. She moved in with my mother, her daughter, in a small house in Kalispell. She brought very few possessions with her. Most of her furniture and household goods she gave away or sold, but she kept the elk hidden. She told my mother it was a gift from an old friend, and my mother, busy with her own life and children, never questioned it further. The hide became a fixture in Eleanor's room, draped over her bed, a constant reminder of the most remarkable night of her long life. And the journal, that remained hidden beneath the floorboards of the abandoned cabin for another 37 years, until I went looking for it in 2004, 5 years after Eleanor finally told me where to search and what I'd find there. Eleanor lived another 52 years after that February night in 1952, carrying her secret through marriage celebrations and funerals, through the births of grandchildren and the slow march of age. She never spoke of it, not once, to anyone. I grew up hearing my grandmother's stories about frontier life, about delivering babies in remote cabins, about surviving brutal winters and dangerous wildlife encounters. But she never mentioned Bigfoot, never hinted at what had happened during that historic blizzard. Looking back now, I understand why. She was protecting them, honoring that unspoken agreement made when the male placed his hand over his heart. Some promises transcend words, and Eleanor Henderson was a woman who kept her promises. I was at her bedside in March of 2019 when everything changed. Eleanor was 94 years old, living in a nursing care facility in Kalispell, her body finally failing after nearly a century of use. I'd driven up from Bozeman, where I'd retired 2 years earlier after 4 decades with Fish and Wildlife. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for several days, the doctors saying it was just a matter of time. But on March 7th, she woke with unusual clarity, her eyes sharp and focused in a way they hadn't been for weeks. She gripped my hand with surprising strength and said she needed to tell me something she'd kept secret her entire adult life. I leaned close, expecting perhaps a confession about some minor transgression, a regret she needed to voice before the end. What she told me instead, in a voice that grew stronger as she spoke, was the story I've just shared with you. She spoke for nearly an hour, taking breaks when she grew tired, but always returning to the narrative, determined to get every detail right. She described the storm, the sound of the juveniles crying in the wind, the weight of their small bodies, the warmth of their fur. She described the mother's face when she was reunited with her children, the ceremony of the gift, the male's hand over his heart. When she finished, she told me where to find her journal, still hidden beneath the floorboards of that abandoned cabin if it hadn't rotted away entirely. She made me promise 2 things. First, that I would investigate, verify what I could, use my scientific training to determine if her memory was accurate or if age and time had distorted what really happened. Second, that if I found proof she was telling the truth, I would protect them, watch over that territory, and make sure their descendants could live in peace. I promised both things, holding her thin hand, seeing the relief flood her face. She died 2 days later, peacefully in her sleep, her secrets finally shared. I spent the next 5 years of my retirement investigating every aspect of her story. I started with the cabin, driving out to the location in June of 2019. The structure was still standing, barely, its roof partially collapsed, windows broken, but the basic frame intact. I brought tools and carefully pulled up the floorboards beneath where her bed had been. The metal box was there, rusted but sealed, and inside was the journal wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. Her handwriting filled page after page, dated entries from January through March of 1952, including detailed descriptions and sketches of everything that had happened. The drawings of the juveniles' faces, their hands, the massive footprints in the snow, all precisely rendered with measurements and notes. This wasn't the confused rambling of someone experiencing dementia. This was the careful documentation of a trained medical professional recording an extraordinary event. I cross-referenced her account with historical records. The National Weather Service archives confirmed the blizzard, showing it hit exactly when she said, with temperatures and snowfall amounts matching her descriptions. Old newspapers from the Whitefish Pilot documented the storm's impact, mentioning that several homesteaders had been cut off for days, that livestock had frozen, that it was the worst winter storm in Montana's recorded history up to that point. Everything she'd written about the weather, the conditions, and the isolation was factually accurate. This wasn't a false memory or a fabricated story. The storm had happened exactly as she described, which meant the rest of her account deserved serious consideration. I began researching Bigfoot sightings in northwestern Montana going back decades. What I found was a consistent pattern of reports from that specific region, the Whitefish Range and surrounding wilderness. Native American accounts from the Blackfeet and Salish tribes described similar creatures, called them by different names but always with the same characteristics. Large bipedal beings covered in hair, intelligent, avoiding human contact, living in family groups. There were modern sighting reports too. Hunters and hikers who'd seen something that didn't match any known animal found tracks that couldn't be explained, heard vocalizations that didn't belong to any cataloged species. The scientific community dismissed all of it, of course, labeled it folklore and misidentification and hoaxes, but I'd spent 40 years studying animal behavior and ecology. I knew how to evaluate evidence, separate legitimate observations from mistakes and frauds, and what I found suggested that something was living in those mountains, something rare and elusive and desperately trying to stay hidden. In 2021, I began making regular trips to the wilderness area where Eleanor's cabin had stood, hiking deep into terrain that few people visited. I brought offerings, leaving them in specific locations, apples and dried fish, and water in containers during dry seasons. I set up game cameras in hidden locations, checking them monthly. Most of the footage showed the expected wildlife: deer and elk, bears and mountain lions, occasionally wolves. But 3 times over the past 3 years, I've captured images that defy easy explanation. Large bipedal figures moving through the forest at dusk, always distant and partially obscured, but there nonetheless. Footprints that appear overnight near my offering sites, tracks that measure 16 to 18 inches long, showing the same humanoid shape Eleanor had sketched 70 years earlier. I'm 71 years old now, the same age my grandmother was when she rescued those 2 freezing children from the blizzard. I don't know how much longer I can make these trips into the mountains, how many more years I can serve as guardian of this secret, but I continue because I made a promise, and because I've come to believe, through careful research and personal observation, that Eleanor told me the truth. Bigfoot exists in the remote corners of the Montana wilderness, living in small family groups, avoiding humans with an expertise developed over generations, possibly centuries. They're not monsters or myths. They're people, different from us, but people nonetheless, with language and culture and families they'll protect with everything they have. Sometimes, when I'm deep in those mountains, I leave apples on flat rocks near the creek where Eleanor used to draw water. They're always gone by morning. Maybe it's bears or deer taking them. Maybe it's something else, a family that remembers an old woman who saved 2 of their children during the worst storm in living memory. A family that honors that debt by watching over her descendants. I choose to believe the latter, because some truths don't require proof, only faith and the willingness to protect something precious and fragile and worth preserving. The elk hide Eleanor kept for 67 years hangs on my wall now, its fur still thick and soft despite its age, a reminder that the world holds more mysteries than we acknowledge, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is keeping a secret that isn't ours to tell.